Good evening and welcome to Neuro Digest, your very first episode of Neuro Digest on Science TV, where we shall be discussing neurological disorders. My name is Sylvia Moraa. My interpreter is Maureen, and we are going to be taking this journey with you. And we hope that you're going to engage us, interact with us on our social media pages that are shown below, and also ask all the questions that you want of what is disability and invisible disability as the main focus we're going to be having today. Most of the times when we hear the word disability, we think about someone walking on on walking sticks, on a wheelchair, a blind person, someone who's deaf. Have you ever known that there is something as invisible disability? I'm sure you're asking. Science TV is usually about the ones who cannot talk or are hard of hearing. And why is she here? I'll give you a brief about Sylvia Moraa and actually why I'm wearing this. As Sylvia Moraa, I'm a mother of 2 children who are neurodiverse, meaning that they are on the autistic spectrum disorder, as we mostly call it autism. My 2 children have been a solid rock. They have taught me to learn how to raise them. They have taught me more than what I could have learned in school about parenting, about living with a child with a disability, and living with a child who you cannot communicate to. What would you do if it was you? Remember, when you get this child, everyone expects a perfect child, and no one gives you warning. All you realize is, oops, something has happened. So how do you deal with it? These are some of the hard questions we're going to be tackling in this first episode and throughout the season of Neuro Digest with me, Sylvia Moraa. So what are invisible disabilities and why did we choose Neuro Digest? As a human being, your body is made up of neurons, and these are the ones that are responsible for communication between your brain, your spinal cord, and your nervous system. So what happens when something goes wrong? Just like in your house, when there's too much electricity, the fuse blows. That means there's no power in either a specific section or the entire house. That's the same thing that happens with our body. So the neurological system, when there is interference, then we have some disorders in the person. That means that we get interference in how we speak, how we move, how we operate, how we process, and generally how we respond in the environment. That is why they're called neurological disorders. And normal human beings, as we say it, is called neurotypical. So neurodiverse means that a person who has diversity and some change in their neurological system. And that is what we are focusing on. I want to help you understand and welcome you to our world as parents, as caregivers, and we shall be meeting some of the people who live with these conditions in our country. We shall be featuring the ones who are on the extreme side, the ones who have made it in life, the parents who have walked the journey, caregivers. How do they go to school? Have you ever wondered? How do they survive? How do they take care of these children in school? What do they need to live a near normal life? These are some of the hard questions we'll be tackling throughout this season. And I'd like for you to stay tuned right here on Science TV as we diverge into this world of neurodevelopmental disorders, and as we might be saying a lot, neurotypical and neurodiverse. Those will be the comparisons that we'll be looking at. And the 4 major that we're going to be focusing on, we'll be having the autism spectrum disorder, ADHD in long, attention deficiency hyperactivity disorder, and Down syndrome and cerebral palsy. And on top of that, we shall be also looking at some of the learning disabilities that the children go through and how, as a parent, you'll be able to deal with them and how you'll be able to adapt to society and what is expected of you as a neighbor. How do you live with these children? Those are some of the other questions that we shall be handling and getting deeper into it. And the experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because trust me, it's not an easy road. Been there, done that. Once again, this is Sylvia Moraa, and my interpreter is Maureen, and we shall be right back as we dive into the details of what is autism, what is cerebral palsy, what is Down syndrome, and what is ADHD in detail. Stay tuned. Good evening once again, and welcome back to Neuro Digest with Andy Speaks and Science TV. I'm your host, Sylvia Moraa, and with me is the interpreter, Maureen. And we are going to dive into who is Andy Speaks. Then we go to the definitions. Andy Speaks for Special Needs Person is a non-for-profit organization that I founded in honor of my 3 children, specifically the 2 who are on the autistic spectrum. And this is because when I look back at the journey and I think of other parents who either have gotten the diagnosis or have not gotten the diagnosis, the future newlyweds who would like to give birth, what will they do when they come and find out that, hey, the doctor just says something is wrong, your child has A, B, C, D? What will you do? How are you going to process it? For us who have already been there and done that, it was like a walk in the forest without a map. Like the doctor tells you, goodbye, good luck, I wish you all the best, because that's the reality of a special needs parent. Going through the services is not a walk in the park. And hence we decided, with the stigma that we have experienced as parents, let us educate society, because it will only get better if you understand my child. That's the only way you'll be able to embrace his difference, because they're not weird, they're not abnormal, they're just different. The same way everyone is different and no one is ever the same to the other. That's the same thing with neurodiverse children. Now, under Andy Speaks, we seek to educate, inspire, advocate, and rally for special needs persons, be it a child, an adult. We will look to go into the policies that surround the society. How are we included? How are we integrated into society? After they go to school, where do they go? Who employs them? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever wondered, the person that you might see walking around and maybe they're talking to themselves and you're busy saying they're mentally ill, is it really mental illness? So let's break that down and let's diverge into the real definitions of some of these neurodiverse conditions, as we call it, neurodevelopmental disorders. So we'll start with cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is often caused by brain damage. This happens before or during the child's birth. This is the first 3 to 5 years of a child's life, and cerebral palsy primarily affects the body movement and the body coordination of a child. So this is something that once a child gets born, during that time, anything can happen. And if they get brain damage, then they get affected. Most of the persons with cerebral palsy have limitations in movement. So they'll be either on a wheelchair or they will not be able to move at all. They might be bedridden, and they may be able to walk with a walking stick, and some walk on their own fairly. So what does this mean? Cerebral palsy affects different sections of the brain, because that is now what affects their movement. Remember when we started, we talked about neurodiversity being about the communication between the head, the spinal cord, and the neurological system in our body. So if the communication breakdown happens, that's why you find they have difficulty in this. Even the communication is affected for people living with cerebral palsy, as we may call it CP. Let's go now to Down syndrome. Down syndrome, also known as trisomy 21, is defined as a genetic disorder that is caused by the presence of all or a third of a copy of chromosome 21. When a child is being formed in the mother's womb, our DNA of the father and the mother, we always have 21. When the last section of the DNA with the chromosomes are combining, if it splits and then rejoins, that makes it 21 and a half on one side. If it duplicates and you have double, that still causes Down syndrome. Or if you have half of it breaking and joining again, that's the same thing. So it typically is associated with the physical growth delays. Characteristics of Down syndrome, you always find that we have the facial features where the eyes will be a bit slit. You will find the hands will look a bit different, and they might have mild to moderate intellectual disability. The other thing is their communication will be challenged in speaking, but most people with Down syndrome always have an easier way to communicate. So there is always the mild and severe for Down syndrome, which is one of the diseases, the neurodiverse diseases that are not very common in Kenya, but very common in other parts of the world. Let's go to autism spectrum disorder. This is the most common of all the neurodiverse conditions that we're currently facing. Is one of the things we're trying to find out, is it that we are more aware, or is it that it has always been there, we've just been looking at it differently? So what is autism? How have you even ever heard of autism? But now let's answer that question for you. Autism spectrum disorder, why spectrum? It's called a spectrum because it is very wide. There is no point you will find one person who has autism similar totally to another person. Autism is an umbrella term for developmental conditions that are marked by persistent, ongoing challenges with social communication and interaction, as well as restricted and repetitive behavior patterns, interests, and activities. Autism-related challenges can range from mild to severe, and they vary from person to person. Every person on the autism spectrum has a unique challenge and different levels of ability. I will dive a bit into this because this is the one that most people are interested in, looking at the questions that we have received. ASD, as we call it in short, and a person who has autism is called an autistic. The condition is called itself, you can call it either autism, ASD, or in full, autism spectrum disorder. Autism has the sign of a puzzle. This also represents the same diversity that it has. Autism covers a span of so many effects in a person that you cannot match one person to another. Even the same children on the spectrum, on the mild spectrum, are not the same. So that's why we have the puzzle, because you have all these different areas that are affected in one's body, and there are different ways that the child gets affected in communication, in sensory, how they socialize, how they relate in society. And the one common factor in all these neurodiverse is the fact that all of them, their communication is affected. You will find 80% of people living with these invisible disabilities are nonverbal. What do I mean by that? This means that a child may be able to hear you, but they might not be able to respond to you. That makes them nonverbal. When a child is 5 and they've not yet started talking, when a child is almost 10 and they've not started talking, it's not that they can't hear you, because there is this one concern as parents we've seen where children are being misdiagnosed as being deaf. So when we go to the doctors, they say the child is deaf, and they start treating deafness, when in actual sense, the child is autistic, meaning that they're not able to process the words. They can hear you, but they're not able to process neurologically to respond to you. The other challenge that you'll find common with the children is the lack of eye contact. Why is this? Most of the children who are affected tend to have a tendency that they can only process 2 to 3 things. So when you're having a conversation, if you're speaking to them, they can look at you and listen as they process the answer. Those are 3 things, which is more than enough what a child can handle who is also neurodiverse. When they're responding to you, 80% of the time, you will see they will not have eye contact with you, because at this time they have to do 3 things also. Remember what you asked, process the answer, and talk it to you. So you will find these are some of the main challenges that we find with neurodiverse children. Now let's dive into ADHD. In long, that's in short. In long, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD has 2 types. There is the one that functions, that affects attention, and there is the one that the child is extra hyper. But let me break it down to you scientifically. ADHD is a common childhood illness that can be treated. It is a health condition involving biologically active substances in the brain that exhibit a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity that is more frequently displayed and more severe than is typically observed in individuals at a comparable level of development. What this means, in our local society, I'm sure there is that one child you always wonder, Why can't they sit still? Why are they all over? Why can't this child just follow instructions? You tell them, do A, they do B. You tell them, go to X, they want to go to Z. Or they'll finish X very fast and jump to whatever else it is that they want to do. They can never settle. They just cannot settle. They're all over, jumping on the table, sitting on someone, pulling another child, that child that looks like they have energizer batteries. Even time for bed is not time for bed for them. So that is what ADHD is. But most of the time we confuse it for a child being indisciplined. Have you ever seen why you could beat a child and discipline him so many times, but this never changes? Because it's just a disability like any other. But all this can be treated or managed. Like ADHD, with the nutrition and the extreme cases, we need to take medicine. Autism spectrum disorder is managed through many ways. There is need for therapy. There is need also for education like any other child in class. We have behavior management, and we have sensory management for the children who have hypersensitivity. For ASD children, autistic children, you'll find that they have their own coping mechanisms. I'm sure we also, the viral video of Cody, the boy who was singing, we all noticed that he was rocking. We all noticed that he had difficulty in speaking, and we noticed that he's blind. Most of the time you'll find persons with neurodevelopmental disorders having underlying medical conditions, especially on the autistic spectrum. Or you'll find that they have cerebral palsy with autism, either mild or severe. Both of them can happen to the same individual. So it always varies. And the other thing I want us to focus on, now that we understand what is actually going on with these children and even adults, you can look at yourself, you can remember that neighbor or that friend that you saw some of these characteristics in. I'm glad that now you know what's going on with them or what it is. So how do we live with them in our society? How do we embrace them? Remember, disability is not inability. It just depends with how you handle them, how you interact with them, how you embrace them. So let us embrace the people who are different, because that's all there is. They're simply different. Engage with us on social media. Bring on the questions, anything that you'd like for us to look at in this first episode of the first season of Neuro Digest. With me, Sylvia Moraa, and my interpreter, Maureen. We shall take a short break and we shall be right back. Thank you. Good evening and welcome back to Neuro Digest. I'm your host Sylvia Moraa with my interpreter Maureen. And like we have spoken earlier, we've touched on the definitions of the various neurodiversity conditions that we have. We have also touched on what is Andy Speaks and why Neuro Digests. As you've seen as a common factor, all the conditions we have discussed, there are certain delays, there are neurological challenges that the children go through that has affected how they live, how they interact. One thing I want us to all remember, that developmental delays are just commas, they're not full stops, and your child can still get there. So if you want to see how to take care of a child who is challenged, look at their siblings, see the love. These children have emotions just like everyone else, even the adults who have lived with these conditions in their lives. You will notice that they have unconditional love because you cannot taint them. The only sad part of that is we take advantage of them. That is the sad reality of what goes on. So, as Andy Speaks, we're trying to look into what are the human rights policies and all the things that we set for ourselves. Have we included the special children? Have we included the adults? How is education? How are their classes? They need more than a regular child needs. They will need the regular classes that everyone gets. On top of that, they need therapy in various kinds. To help them with their speech, they need speech therapy. To help them with their fine motor skills and general movements, they need physiotherapy and occupational therapy. Remember, as we said, it's about communication between your brain, your spinal cord, and your nervous system. So if there's a breakdown of communication, they will find it hard to coordinate when they want to reach out, when they have to eat. This is especially noticed in the persons who have the extreme effects of either autism, cerebral palsy, and Down syndrome, because they need much more care than the ones who have mild to lower end of the challenges that we have spoken about. So as a community, how do we integrate? What do you do as an individual when that child comes to you and never talks? Do we go saying the way they have bad attitude? Or do we embrace or even take a minute to find out, hey, what could be the problem? Have you ever tried to even learn sign language or how to say hi? Or used pictures to just try and communicate so that you can connect with them? It's not that they're deaf. They hear you perfectly well. Even when you talk ill of them, they hear you. They still have emotions. They're human. The only thing is they're a bit different. Let me move to a question that we have received from one of our viewers. Rose asks, how soon can a parent know of developmental issues before diagnosis, especially when the doctors insist to be patient and children have different times of reaching milestones? In all the four that we have discussed, I will touch on cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and autism, because those are the ones that we can have early intervention. Early intervention means you recognize that something is wrong and do something about it, because only then will a parent have enough time to act and do things that are right. But that only comes when, as a parent, you embrace your child. We all know, and we have learned in school, and even our grandmothers have taught us as mothers, when a child is born, by a certain age, they should be able to sit up straight. When you're breastfeeding your child after delivery, how well has the child latched onto the breasts when they're breastfeeding? Are they looking at you as a mother when you talk to them? Do they do the coos and cars when you're doing all the small ticklies when you do to children? How do they respond? Do they smile back? Do they stare at you blankly? Are they least bothered? How is the neck development, the neck support of your child? Are they able to sit stable, hold their neck upright by the right time? This is tentatively 3 months. A child should be able to hold their head independently when you're holding them. When it gets to 6 months, have they attempted to sit? Have they attempted to crawl? Yes, children have different speeds, but then there is a threshold which you should look at. And the minute you notice one of this, it is the time that you start paying more attention to the development stages of your child. Have they started walking? At what age did they start walking? Are they talking at the desired age? Remember, within the first 18 months, this is 1.5 years, some of these things like crawling should already have happened. So as a mother, when this doesn't happen, talk to your nurse or the doctor, or just pay a bit more attention to your child and all the other things that they're interested in. The more they grow, then the more the symptoms are visible. Because as a boy, you expect them to like cars. As a girl, you expect them to start liking dolls. And what you recognize with especially the autistics, you'll find that they have zero interest in what we normally stereotypically say is what a boy or a girl should be interested in. And they will go for the one thing that is very weird. And those are some of the things that you can look at, because we had asked about development issues, early diagnosis. The other question that we have is, can diagnosis be made before birth, or what corrective measures can be taken, if any? When it comes to diagnosis in Africa, we are slightly behind. In the US, autistic children are able to be given early diagnosis as early as the age of 2. In African countries, we have 4 to 6 years. If you get one that gets earlier than that, then you're lucky. And most of the time, it ends up being the extreme cases, because you find that autism can sometimes affect our the physical function of a person when it is on the extreme side of the spectrum. The one thing that you can be able to notice almost immediately is cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy, because of how the child is unable to relate, to move. Because remember, we said it is the muscles that are affected. So these are things you can see early. In other countries, they're able to diagnose this while the parent is still pregnant, as early as 4 months pregnant. So in Africa, we are not there yet. But we hope that something is being done so that we are able to have at least the parents prepared in advance. I know in the US and the European countries, the parents are given the option of terminating the pregnancy. That is something that in Africa we are not advocating. We do not advocate for we respect life. But this early diagnosis gives a parent that opportunity to say, yes, I'd like to still carry my child to term, or no, I'd like to terminate. But that only applies in other continents, not in Africa. And in our continent, we're not there yet. We are not yet able to diagnose early in time. Maybe in future we'll catch up with the rest of the world. When it comes to Down syndrome, remember we said it has a lot of facial ID. I find out that the children look a bit different. They will be flat-faced. You will find that their eyes will be a bit slit, and their hands will be a bit different. We shall share on our social media pages how these physical challenges appear when we dive deeper into Down syndrome. But for the diagnosis, that can be done pretty early, as soon as a few months after the child is born, because of the effect of the physical appearance. Hope that answers some of the questions that you had, Rose, and we appreciate that you sent us our questions. So, my viewers, if you have any questions for the next episode, we shall be diving into ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. So if there is any topic you'd like us to dive into, let us know. If there's a person you'd like to hear from, because we're going to be touching on areas: health, education, therapy, nutrition, and real life experiences. Also, we shall be inviting parents who have more than one child on the spectrum, so that we can understand and see how they cope, and then hear how they've gone through the challenges that we go through as parents, the stigma, the fight for the basic rights for our children, the lack of integration in the system, lack of education support. And we shall be able to dive in deeper and try and see what can the government do? What can you do as the next person, as the neighbor, as the friend? These are the things we shall be looking at as we go deeper into our season. And thank you for being a gracious audience. We're coming to the end of our first episode of Neuro Digest. I hope to see you next Tuesday, same time on Science TV, with me, Sylvia Moraa, and Maureen, my interpreter. Thank you, and see you next week. Ciao.